Good morning, everyone. We are in Judges chapter 3 today. We have gotten through our big double introduction that takes place in the first two chapters of Judges, kind of generally describing the state of the people, giving us a version of what the cycle's going to be that will happen throughout the majority of this book. And now we are just about ready to move on to our first judge. But the first thing that we see in the first 6 verses of chapter 3 is kind of a list of some of the oppressors that are going to be facing Israel over the next few hundred years. And the purpose of all of this. So question number 1 is, what was God doing through Israel's failure? Did Israel pass the test? Remember, the failure, we said in chapter 2, was that they, when after Joshua died, they forgot God. They were worshiping idols and going all kinds of evil. What was God doing throughout all this? He was testing them. I heard somebody say that. Yes, Betty. So he was testing them. And what else? We talked about it a little bit last week. What else on the people who were still there in the land? What did God decide to do with those people who were there? Yeah, sold them into the hands of these oppressors at different times. The thing, like, God did not do everything for them. He did not finish driving out the people when Israel was not willing to do that. So they remained, and we reminded ourselves last week of the way it said it in Joshua, that these people would become thorns in their eyes, or thorns in their side here in Judges, that they're going to be a problem for them, going to cause them a lot of pain in the future. Okay? Yeah, so then there was the practical consideration that God is going to use this bad thing to at least have some kind of good consequence, and God is able to do that. We see all throughout the Bible where God takes the failures and the sins of people and still accomplishes something good with it. Think of how Judas betrayed Jesus. That is, very much a bad thing that's objectively a sin, but God uses it for something good. Here, Israel has failed. They've left these people in the land. They're going to be hurt and oppressed by these nations around them and among them. But God is able to use it for something good, at least, in that the people will be prepared for war. They will remember how to fight. We're going to have generations passing here. Even if your grandparents knew how to be warriors, it doesn't mean that you do. So these people are going to have to remember how to fight, and they're going to be in a position to still maintain their position in this land. So this gives an opportunity to keep Israel ready for war. Does Israel pass the test? No, they don't. That is the message of Judges. Israel does not pass this test. The test of leaving the nations here, but God's not going to do it for them. They still have an opportunity to be faithful to God. It is possible for them to totally serve God in sincerity and devotion and to overcome the influence of these nations around them and among them. Israel absolutely does not do that.
They intermarry, and then they start worshiping idols.
Right, yes. They are mixing the cultures and communities here. They are taking the gods and the practices of these other peoples. We have kind of a list of some of these oppressors, so these other peoples that they're mixing with. It's the Philistines, Canaanites, Sidonians, Hivites, Amorites, Perizzites, Jebusites. Those are listed there. There's more. We'll see the Mesopotamians in chapter 3 as well. But it's all these peoples who are going to influence Israel in a medley of ways. Dave.
Not only did they become influenced, their children became influenced.
Right.
And that is to bring that back to today, we think sometimes we can hang around people who are in sin and not be influenced. Now, I'm not saying we should go talk to them and teach them, or we should, we absolutely need to. But at some point when you see it's not going to work, that's why Paul said, shake the dust off your feet. You need to move to someone else.
Right.
Because if you become influenced by them, you are, well, just by your difference, in your faith and worship of God, you're already influencing your kids in some how, in some ways. So it's a good lesson for us.
Yeah. Very often, each subsequent generation wants to kind of take another step beyond what the parents did. They watch their parents take a step beyond what their grandparents did, and now we're going to take a step beyond you, and that's how we just slide generation after generation. And that's another message of Judges, that it's a cycle, but it's not a flat cycle, it's a spiral. We're going downhill for a few hundred years where things are getting worse and worse. Kathy.
I thought it was interesting that going back to Exodus 23, verse 13, it says, "And in all that I have said to you, be circumcised and make no mention of the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your mouth." So here they're worshiping these gods, and they were not even to mention them.
Yeah. So God really warned them, but the sin was closer than they realized. Yeah. That's the supreme arrogance of man to say, I can have this sin around me, I can tolerate it in others, and it's not going to affect me. We say that all the time, and it seems to immediately affect us. Israel doesn't even last that long. It's not like, they held out and they were faithful to God for 10 generations and then finally they cracked. That's not what it is. It's as soon as there were people who no longer remembered Joshua, things started going downhill. Yeah, Kathy.
I wanted to ask a question. How long was the generation? I was thinking it was 20 years, but I'm not sure if it was 40 years.
So generally, they kind of do the 40-year for a generation thing. And now that you've brought that up, when we see there's a little bit of debate on the time periods you get throughout Judges, a lot of the years are in multiples of 40. And so it's possible that those are maybe not literally 40 years, literally 80 years, but basically a generation or 2 generations loosely. And that is another way to explain something that we talked about where if you add up all the years, you get like 400 something years when really there should only be about 300 years from the death of Joshua to Saul becoming king. So your 2 ways of addressing that are either that these judges overlapped each other somewhat, which is very reasonable to think as they're dealing with regional issues. Some of those problems can overlap. Or that 40 doesn't have to mean exactly 40 years, that is a round number for the span of a generation. Andrea? So even back in Deuteronomy, God, before this ever even happens, God tells them how it's going to go down. He tells them, you're not supposed to keep these people among you. You're supposed to eradicate them when you go in. It is time for their judgment. But because I know that you're not going to do that, he says it's all the way back in Deuteronomy and in Exodus. I know you're not going to do that in completion. And so they're going to be there among you, and this is how you're supposed to deal with them. This is, keep away from them, keep separate from them, don't mingle, don't intermarry, don't take their gods as your gods. So they should already know that. They know that the presence of these people doesn't mean that they should be associated with them and friends with them if they know the law. And that's the hang-up, and that they probably don't know the law that well, because they, generation after generation now, they're kind of not talking about the law, not reading it, not being familiar with it. So with that, we move on to our first judge. Othniel is not the most exciting judge as far as a rousing story goes, but Othniel is extremely important for understanding the book of Judges. Othniel is the archetypal judge. What I mean by that is he is the ideal. Everything that happens here in the story of this first cycle goes about as well as it can. Othniel does everything right that we are told. I'm not trying to suggest that he was sinless, but the point being is that he was a righteous judge. He is able to overwhelm the enemies. He's able to deliver Israel without some of the deep flaws that we see later. So by the time you get to the end of Judges, where you have people like Gideon and Samson, Samson's a mess. Samson delivers the people, kind of, but he's not a particularly moral person, and it's a much more complicated deliverance than what we see with Othniel. So in the spiral, the way it happens first is very clean-cut, very straightforward, easy. I'm not trying to suggest that the oppression was not hard. The oppression was very hard. But the way that Othniel can deliver them is very effectively and with a high degree of righteousness. So this doesn't make for a fascinating story like some of the others do, but it is a much more effective deliverance in general. Okay?
Well, it's kind of interesting to me because he's not even an Israelite.
Right.
So here's somebody that's not even an Israelite that's getting rid of this oppressor that came down from the north.
Yeah.
It was really a lot of oppression because the other country came down from the north all the way to Judah.
Yeah.
So they were pretty occupied.
Mm-hmm.
And he had already proven himself when he captured the city that Caleb wanted to capture. And so he was able to capture it. He was able to get Caleb's daughter as a wife.
Yeah.
So he was a very good soldier.
Right. So Othniel, like Caleb, was not an Israelite, but he has joined Israel. He has kind of proselytized, and he's become an Israelite, but he's not that by blood. And that is a twist of irony to that being the first judge and the one who shows the most righteousness, the most morality out of any of them. It's somebody who, by blood, isn't even really one of the chosen nation. And that is an indictment against Israel, that they're already in such a bad condition that there's not a native Israelite among them to rise up and to be that judge. Dave.
Well, it says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and I can't, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember any of the other judges having that happen.
Yeah.
With that, it's he incorporated the principles of God in how he ruled as a judge. And in Zechariah 4:6, God says, not by my might, nor by my power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. That's how he wants
Yeah.
us and he wanted
Yeah.
to rule and
Right.
to live. And so that was a great thing because he did that, and he was a fair and righteous person, not like what we're reading for the children of Israel.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. Othniel is already in pretty stark contrast to the nation as a whole. And that's a bad thing since we are at the beginning of the spiral when things are not as bad as they're going to get. There's already a large difference between the righteous judge and the nation as a whole. Question number 2, just let's rewind a little bit. Go ahead, Betty. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, go ahead.
Othniel was Caleb's nephew as well as his son-in-law.
Right, yes. So Othniel is Kenaz's son, so that makes him Caleb's nephew, and then he marries Caleb's daughter as well. That sort of thing was much more common back then. Smaller populations, smaller groups of people. Raises an eyebrow for us today, but very common back then. So, okay. So before we're even talking about Othniel, let's just talk about the decline of the people. Right? Question number 2. What did the people do? What caused their problems? They intermarried with the people around them. Was that Matt?
Evil in the sight of the Lord, once again.
Evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay. We're going to be answering that sort of question a lot in this class. What did the people do? Evil in the sight of the Lord. Right? That question and answer is repeated for a reason. God is not being arbitrary or capricious with this idea that, well, sometimes he's going to help the people and sometimes he's not. There's a reason. Every time an oppressor comes in, it's because Israel has done evil in the sight of the Lord. They have forgotten God. They are worshiping idols. They are working evil among themselves. They are not being faithful to God. And if you remember from the Deuteronomy class, again and again, God said, I am making this covenant with you. You are obligated to keep it, and if you will keep it, I will bless you greatly, and when you do not keep it, I will curse you, I will punish you. And God is following through again and again. So you can get a little bit weary of how much Israel suffers in this book, but keep in your mind, they deserve it each and every time. They are sinning against God, they are rebelling against God, and they are bringing this oppression upon themselves. Cool? So God's response to that is what, as we've said? They do evil on the side of the Lord, and what does God do to them?
He delivers them to Cushan Risha. That word means doubly evil.
Yeah.
So he delivers them into, I think they're Mesopotamia.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting that they're doubly evil.
Yeah.
Someone who was much more wicked even than the Israelites.
Right. That was probably not the name that he went by among his own people. Well, that's the name that they call him here. Your pronunciation is as good as mine on that, by the way. So, the Cushan Risha name, whatever that his name is, that it does mean like dumbly evil. It's basically evil and dumb, and that is a pejorative to show kind of how much of a bumbling fool he is in many ways, that he is an evil king himself, but God allows them to take over Israel, to oppress Israel, because Israel has failed God. Remember that Israel can overcome anybody, any city, any king, any army. The whole story of Joshua was them winning battles that they shouldn't have won so long as they were faithful to God. But when they're not faithful to God, then the dumb and evil king can come in and oppress them. How long did he oppress them?
18.
8 years is what this said. 8 years.
Yeah.
Yes. So 8 long years of oppression that they are having to work for this king, be enslaved by this king, pay tribute to him. They don't have their own freedom to do what they want. They're under the control of this other nation. That's a hard thing to go through. What did God do? Or, no, excuse me. Yeah, question number 3. So they're serving this king for 8 years. Question number 3, what did the people do in their oppression? They cried out to God. Very important thing I want you to know about this phrase, cried out to God, because just like we're seeing that they did evil on the side of the Lord, and that repeats over and over, we also are going to see this phrase, they cried out to the Lord over and over. But this is not the same kind of crying out to the Lord that we see in other parts of the Bible where somebody says, God, I know that I have sinned. I know that I am evil and that I need you and that I need your forgiveness. I need your blessings. It's not that penitent cry. This word for crying out to the Lord is basically a yelp of pain. It's crying out in desperation, looking for help, but not a focused kind of repentance. They're still not really turning to God. They just want out of their trouble. And that's what we're going to see throughout this cycle, that it takes God doing something to even get them to the point of wanting to repent a little bit. And so what is that something? What does God do hearing their cry of pain?
Takes pity upon them.
Yeah.
Once again.
He takes pity upon them. And what does he do in taking pity on them?
Raises up Othniel.
Raises up Othniel. Okay, so you see that we're charting out the same basic outline of a cycle that we looked at before. We're charting this same thing out. Israel has sinned against God. They're sold into the hands of oppressors. They cry out in pain and distress. And then God takes compassion on them and raises up a deliverer for them. In this case, that's Othniel. But at this point, even as God has raised up Othniel, the people are still not penitent. They're just desperate. And Othniel is going to have to guide them some into coming back to God. What do we learn about God from this? Andrea? Yeah.
He's always there even when we're making the worst of the worst mistakes.
Yeah. God was legitimately angry with Israel, but that didn't mean he had written them off completely. He had compassion on them, and he did not want them to suffer. They were suffering, and that was the right thing to happen there, but God is looking for an opportunity to relieve that suffering. And you're right, Andrea, God does the same with us, that when we make bad choices, when we are going away from him, God is angry with us, but he doesn't write us off and say, boy, Danny's without hope. There's just nothing that, God's looking and waiting for me to make a better choice. And God is extending a hand and showing compassion even before I might be penitent. That's the whole point of the parable of the prodigal son, right? That the father is looking and waiting and hoping, and when the son is starting to come back, the father runs out to meet him. It doesn't even let the son make the full appeal for forgiveness. He's that eager to forgive. That's the way God is with us. He is angry with us when we sin. He will punish us when we sin, but he desperately wants us to come back to him. He's compassionate even in our suffering.
He's merciful.
He is merciful. And that is noteworthy here, and it's noteworthy even when this happens again and again and again throughout Judges. Sue?
That picture of long suffering.
Yes, right. I like that word for it, long suffering. You can say patient. Patient's great, but long suffering. God is long suffering with his people on a scale that we can't even imagine, because he's doing this generation after generation. I can't fathom that. I can't have compassion on multiple, all these, tens of generations of people. I don't live that long, but God can. Andrea?
I was just going to say it's important in that time and this time not to feel safe here. This is not this is not our home.
Yeah.
There's a purpose where we're here, and it's to follow God. I feel like whenever you're in a moment that you're saved, you obviously forget about God because you're in a good place.
Right. And how easy is it for Israel to say, well, we got to the promised land, we have this land now. God's not really going to give us a hard time about the ticky-tack details, is he? Well, God does care that you keep his covenant. God does care that you obey him. Even for his people, God is not more lenient with Israel than he is with the nations around Israel. He's not more lenient with us than he is with people out in the world. He shows mercy upon everyone who's seeking him, But he holds us to a standard that you need to obey him. You need to continue to seek him. Yeah, Mark.
There's a lot of stuff that isn't said here that I found interesting. In that we don't see often, we go back to God. And within the historical part of it, they had to have fought some wars and lost. And that's where they got to this position of being oppressed. They knew for some reason they couldn't defeat these people. And I kind of made the assumption that Othniel is telling them, this is God, this is not me. And it kind of shows, for me anyway, people who tend, as humans, we want to see God in a person. And God does that through the Christ. He did send somebody.
Yeah.
He did send a man. And this is kind of a foreshadowing when I read it in this sense.
Absolutely.
I really struggle with what you're saying is that they not really come back to God because immediately after the guy dies, they just go back to what they were doing. And were they putting their faith in the man?
Yeah.
And they just never came back to God? It just is really a struggle to read this and not know exactly.
It is, yeah. And the spiritual revival of this, you're right, there's not really much of anything said about it, other than that Othniel judged the people, not just delivered, but judged the people. So there is a component that he is judging their actions and bringing some spiritual instruction to them. We have the Spirit of the Lord being upon Othniel. So it is more than just he is a military hero who's delivered them. But you're right, it's kind of this gaping hole, like I think in some ways glossed over because of how quickly it goes away. And that's Judges. It goes away quickly. They have rest for a certain amount of time, and then they forget. So is it that they're putting more trust in the deliverer himself instead of God? That's a pretty reasonable take. Or is it just that they can believe in God, they can trust in God when they're desperate and when they're reminded, and then as soon as things are good again, we just fall into complacency? That's reasonable as well, and probably a mix of both, depending on who you're talking about within the nation. Aaron.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you know that the people just cried out in pain and weren't repentant? Based on the Hebrew word that's used?
Yeah, I think that's based on the Hebrew word. It's more just that like cry of pain in general.
And then he judged them for 40 years. We just said that was a generation. So
Yeah.
it's possible that whole generation was still faithful to God, and then the next generation wasn't.
Right. And let me clarify, when I say that they were not penitent, that's at least at first. The impetus to cry out to God is desperation, not guilt. First is desperation and pain. Othniel then is showing them you need to come back to God, and to some degree they do. And I think the message here is this generation, this 40 years, more or less comes back to God to at least some degree. There is some level of spiritual revival, some level of we're going to worship God again. But it doesn't last beyond this generation. So somehow it's not sticking. Whether that means that their faith was shaky enough that they wouldn't pass it on to their kids, or the influence around them was so heavy and so evil that they're not really overcoming that. Somehow it's not lasting long. In the next one, it'll be 2 generations. They're a little bit more successful on the second one in some ways. But even still, it fades pretty quickly.
Well, even today, when we look at, like, my grandchildren, they weren't alive when 9/11 happened. Their
Right.
experiences, their worldview, everything is different from generation to generation. They don't cling or hang on to the things that their parents taught them or raised them with, because their experiences are different. I don't think it's changed much since
Right,
then. I
yeah.
think each generation, until something bad happens, but I don't know. I can't explain it other than they walk away from.
Yeah. If you don't, it takes a lot of work to pass something on to the next generation and to make it as important to them as it is to you. Particularly when it's something you have personally experienced, like, we crossed over the Jordan, we conquered these people, we saw God make the walls of Jericho fall when we didn't do anything to breach those. We saw it. Now, past that importance and dedication to the next generation, how do you do that? That's why in Joshua there was so much of the memorials and how you repeat the law and repeat the stories of what happened again and again. We had reference to the book of Jasher that they had even songs about these events that were supposed to be a part of their lives and a part of their worship. That is the struggle of every generation, to pass on to your kids, to your grandkids, what is important to you. And because eventually your kids get to make their own decisions, and you have to instill enough love and dedication in them that they'll do that. Dave?
Well, this is nothing new, really. God, Satan provides the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and pride of life. And we also know that God does not force anyone, Old Testament or New, to serve Him.
Right.
So God gave, I don't use the word gave, He allowed them to have what they wanted,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Mhm.
They wanted to go sinful, He allowed them to do it.
Yeah.
Not without consequence. We know that Christ, over in Mark 10, says, you have to give up things if you want to serve me, including, bad relationships and all those things, even if they're romantic. I don't know. But the point is that this is something that's been there and will be there for as long as we're on this earth, or people are on the earth, that God allows you to, if you want to go and sin, then go ahead and sin. You're going to pay the consequences for it, but go ahead. I don't believe that back to what Andrea said about being tested, this is a test. It's a test for us.
Yeah.
That, like guys like Othniel, I'm sure he taught, and the people taught as much as they could. But at the end of the day, there was a bunch of people who wanted to do what they wanted to do. And that is nothing new. It happens today.
Yeah.
They do what they want to do.
Right.
And unfortunately, they don't realize until it's too late, consequences. Then they cry out, help me, help me, help me.
Right.
So this is something to consider, because it's free will.
Yeah. Right.
And this is the problem with people, that we need to teach our kids, and other people. You have free will, but you got to be careful about aligning yourself with sin and sinful people, because you are going to fall neck deep in it, and you'll cry out. But then what's God going to do? What did He do? He gave consequence to it, didn't He? He allowed them to be taken over, and Eglon takes away and power these guys to come and put them back into captivity. Yeah. So, long story short, this is Satan.
Yeah.
Satan doing it. God's allowing it to happen.
Yeah.
And I think it is a test. A lot of tests. He tests us all the time to see how, if we're going to step up to the plate and do what He wants. Because I think they knew. I don't think they didn't know, unless their parents were idiots and didn't teach them anything. But I don't believe that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, God's commands are not arbitrary. And the reason why He wanted them to drive out the people, to eradicate those people, as we talked about it in Joshua, it was a judgment against those people because they had reached a point of wickedness that their hearts were hard, the wickedness was running rampant, they were not receptive to God at all. It was their time for judgment. Now, Israel has somewhat subverted that, and now they're allowing these people to go beyond their time of judgment. You think that makes the people there more righteous or less? The wickedness, it becomes more and more depraved. Then the influence on Israel, they're supposed to have the peace within their borders, they're supposed to not have this evil influence so close among them. Now they do. And we see Israel fall into shocking levels of sin over and over throughout their history, their lives are so much harder because they didn't do what God said. It's just the very next generation that's already worshiping the gods of the people who were not strong enough to resist Yahweh conquering their cities and their armies. Yet their kids say, yeah, we want to worship their gods. Their gods are really great. Why, and you say, like, are their parents idiots? Like, did they not? I think they did tell them these things. They told them, but somehow the importance of it has not really been passed on, in that the next generation is perfectly fine to move on to these other forms of evil. Now, to be clear, sometimes the next generation does better than the one before. Like, you had the generation that was wandering in the wilderness, and they were not allowed to go into the land by God. And it was the next generation that was more faithful and did better. It is possible for that to happen, but it's not easy. It's usually a struggle and a bit of a losing battle to get the next generation to have the same level of faith that the previous one did. And that's what we have to fight for today as well, that the next generation is prepared to be as faithful as we are, and to say, look, in my weaknesses, do better than my weaknesses. Do better than I did. There's some things you shouldn't imitate me in. Take a better path than I did in certain areas. We want our kids to do even better than we did. And in matters of faith and the spiritual things, that means, put God first and make those good decisions from the beginning. So, Betty.
I think we kind of covered this, but in verse 8, where it says, therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. I just can't believe that his anger is not hot against our country right now.
Yeah.
The evil that's so obvious, flaunting for everybody.
Yeah,
It's a scary thing.
it is. It is.
He's not hot against us.
Yeah. In tonight's sermon, we're going to talk about the role and purpose of a righteous minority is in a land of evil. So we'll talk some about those things and how that works, how God treats that situation. We'll be studying Genesis 18. But yeah, we see reflections in how they were getting more and more evil in those days. We're getting more and more evil today. Our country is, and throughout the world, more evil is being tolerated, being promoted and celebrated in every area of life. And that's a scary thing. God's not happy with that.
I would just say that evil is a symptom of something much larger, like what they were doing is, and this is the issue God has with anybody who wants to put anything at the level of God in their life. And they were putting other gods in their life, which allowed evil in their lives. So the evil was a symptom of these other gods that they were serving.
No.
And this is something that he keeps doing with them over and over. If you're not willing, I'm not willing.
Yeah.
I'll just give you over to these people.
Yeah.
And it's much the same thing here. It's a symptom, is what David was talking about. There's much larger spiritual forces that we don't see, but they're active right now.
Yeah. What's amazing from God's perspective is, that's true, what you're saying there. It is absolutely true. But like when you look at the arc of things, like God is patient and blesses them for a while even after they've left him. And he is quicker to show compassion on them before they've even really repented, and even just when they're crying out in pain. It's like God is slow to anger and quick to compassion. But even with that being said, there's a point of like, hey, if you're not willing to serve me, I'm not willing to keep on blessing you indefinitely. So you're going to have to endure it then. Kathy, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when they were introduced to these gods, the Baals and the Ashtoreths, those gods offered a lot of sexual pleasure.
Yeah.
Once a person has that influence in their life and they're having sexual pleasure, they don't want to hear about God.
And look how powerful they are. They conquered us, right? Even though he's the dumb and evil king, so his name is, he's strong enough to conquer us. That even kind of reinforces the idea that, oh, maybe these gods are really great. They're learning the wrong lesson out of it. It's not that their gods are so great. It's that God is punishing you, and God's allowing this to happen to you because of your sin. It is, when they've gotten a taste of the pleasure that the idolatry and the paganism gives them, the indulgence of sexual lust and all other kinds of lust and sin, it creates a lot of problems where they don't want to come back to God. So we've did some of these things out of order, but we talked about Othniel. He's Caleb's nephew and married to Caleb's daughter. We mentioned that back in Joshua, he showed courage and faith when conquering Kiriath Sefer. He was willing to do what most of the people were not. When Caleb said, hey, whoever goes and conquers that city, I'll give him my daughter as a wife. And Othniel says, sounds good, I'm going. He was strong, he was courageous, he believed that God would grant the victory. Is it any wonder that some years later God is able to use him again to be a force of righteousness and a call to repentance for the nation? As Israel is declining, Othniel is not. His faith is solid and strong. He's very notable for his faith then and here in Judges 3. So as we mentioned, he was filled with the Spirit, and he judged Israel. So he brings a spiritual revival to them, to whatever degree that worked. He overpowers the Mesopotamians. So what I want you to get out of that was, in the future, when there's deliverance, it's going to come through deceit, trickery, strange schemes. Some of the deliverance is complicated, it's not complete, there's all sorts of complication to it. Here, Othniel is filled with the Spirit, he judges Israel, and he overpowers Mesopotamia. They are fully driven back, and Israel is fully delivered from the hands of their oppressors. There's no scheme necessary, there's no evil or deceit or anything mentioned. It is simply that Othniel delivers them without complication and without trouble. I'm sure there was war. Just because it's not detailed here doesn't mean that there wasn't fighting. There absolutely was, but there's no complication to this. It's as simple as it gets, and where that's going to stand in contrast to what we see with future judges. As he delivers them, there's 40 years of rest afterwards, so the generation of rest. So to Aaron's point earlier, it seems that this generation, to some degree, listened to what Othniel had to say, and they had some level of spiritual revival. They repented, and they came back to God, at least somewhat, because there's 40 years of rest. But it was either shaky or just did not pass on to the next generation, because it only lasts for one. And then we're going to get into trouble all over again. There is no criticism of Othniel's character anywhere in this. No criticism of his actions. There is no morally gray behavior. There is no deception. There is no weird character flaws. I say that because, again, when we get later on, you look at Samson and you go, Samson is not a good person. Gideon is kind of a good person and then also not really a good person. Like, we're going to descend into escalating degrees of moral grayness, of moral just uncertainty, and even some pretty evil things. So use Othniel as the archetype. He is what the judge is supposed to be, and a reflection of the fact that Israel at this point will hear the message of the Lord and will respond to it. In the future, even the deliverers are going to be some level of gray. Okay? Thank you, everyone. Next week, we will move on to Ehud in chapter 3, verse 12. I'm do Shamgar as well.